Okay, so this week, meaning in mitzvahs, this one we're doing is mitzvah 243, perhaps one of the most famous mitzvahs in the Torah, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love our fellow Jew as ourselves, perhaps also misunderstood or difficult to understand this mitzvah. In Parshas Kedoshim, there were so many to choose from in Acharon Mos Kedoshim. We might spend a few weeks looking at some other ones, but this one we couldn't obviously give up the opportunity of looking at this one. So we're going to dive straight in with the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch on this mitzvah says, mitzvah 243, mitzvah Avas Yisrael, to love a fellow Jew. To love the soul of another Jewish person. To have compassion for another Jew and for their possessions. Just as a person has compassion on themselves and also on their own possessions. And I think the Chinuch here is getting straight to the heart of the question, which is, once the internal difficulty with this mitzvah is, how can you be commanded or expected to love somebody as you love yourself? And that's what one of the questions we'll have to grapple with. So what is the basis of this mitzvah? As it says, it says in Vayikra chapter 19, verse 18, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, you shall love your fellow as your friend, as yourself. And l'recha, always in rabbinic literature, under the understanding of Torah language, recha is your friend, meaning your fellow Jew. V'amru zichronam levracha, and famously, our sages say in the Gemara in Shabbos, this is Hillel's formulation of this mitzvah. That which is hateful to you, don't do to your friend. Now, the obvious question on this is, why did Hillel flip it to a negative? The Torah says, you have to love your fellow as yourself, which means positively love them. So Hillel flips it and says, that which is hateful to your friend, don't do to them. So I think the idea that why he flips it into the negative is that, again, this comes to the fundamental question of how can you love somebody as you love yourself? How's that physically possible? So maybe you could answer, well, what the Torah is saying is, it doesn't have to be to the extent to which you love yourself, but at least be able to desist from doing things that you yourself wouldn't want someone to do to you. And that we can all understand and comprehend. So that's the way of understanding it. When it says love your fellows yourself, means at the very least, don't do anything which you to somebody you wouldn't want them to do, someone to do to you. And also we know famously, Ba'amid b'Sifra, it's brought down in the Sifra, says Amar Rabbi Akiva Kal Gadol b'Torah. So says Rabbi Akiva, this is the great principle of the Torah. And in fact, if we go back to Hillel's statement, this continuation of that is, he says that everything else is Perish. Zil Gamot, go and learn. He says, really, that is the essence of the Torah. And what is the background of that Gemara in Shabbos? It's a famous incident of Hillel and Shammai, of the prospective convert coming and saying, convert me on condition that you teach me the whole of the Torah while standing on one leg. And Shammai dismisses him, whereas Hillel tells him this principle: that which is hateful to you, don't do to anybody else. The rest is merely commentary. Go and learn. Meaning, if you want to distill the whole of the Torah down into one principle, it's this: to love your fellow as yourself. We'll see, because everything really flows from it. And it also is the prevention for doing everything. So all positive things flow from it, and all negative things are avoided because of that. Now, again, just a very interesting way of looking at it. The Maharsha on that Gemara in Shabbos says, what was that whole incident about with Hillel and Shammai and the prospective convert? And why, in fact, the Gemara says that Shammai, when he dismissed him, sort of he flicked him away using a builder's measuring yard, a yardstick. And Maharsha explains that actually what was the fundamental difference between Shammai and Hillel in this, which was that Shammai was being asked, or the convert was being asking, what one pillar does the Torah stand on? If you could distill it all down onto one foundation, what would it be? Hillel says that's impossible. the Torah cannot stand on one foundation. If you build something using just one pillar, it would not be secure. You need a broad-based you need broad foundations, wide foundations, and that's what the point he was making by dismissing him with the Yamas Abinish, the builder's yard, saying it needs to be a broad foundation. Hillel was of the opinion, no, actually you could distill it. If you really looked at everything, and the Chazal tell us that the Torah started with an act of kindness, with God creating the world and human beings, and it ended with an act of kindness with God himself burying Moshe Rabbeinu. The rest in between is merely just an expansion on that one principle. So that's what we're seeing straight away in this. And that's what Rabbi Kiva meant when he said, Zekal Gadol Torah. This is the great principle of the Torah. That if we can absorb into ourselves this feeling for our fellow Jews, then everything else will flow from it and everything negative will be prevented. So he says, he needs to say, what does it mean by it is the great principle? There are many mitzvahs which in the Torah which actually are dependent on this. Because if a person loves their friend like themselves, they wouldn't steal from them, that they wouldn't commit adultery with their wife, and they wouldn't cheat them with his money or hurt them in any way. Nor they would impinge on their boundaries, nor would they harm them in any way. Many other mitzvahs also are dependent on this. He says the truth is, any person with any intellect will be able to discern this. That really the roots of, especially the mitzvahs between Adam Lechavero, one person and another person, interpersonal relationships, are really all could just be distilled into this mitzvah. He goes on and says, Shirish HaMitzvah Yadua. Normally he expands a bit more about the idea behind the mitzvah. Here he says the basis of this mitzvah is well known. That as a way a person acts with their friend, it goes both ways. That's how they will deal to them. It's almost, you might think, well, it's the most selfless mitzvah. Actually, it has benefits for you as well. If you treat another person with respect, then they are more likely to treat you with respect. If you avoid doing anything which can be damaging to them, then they're more likely to do not to do something which is damaging to you. And we'll see actually when we'll see the next sources further down. Actually, it's very interestingly within Parshas Kedoshim where this mitzvah actually sits, and it will give us a little insight into that. Let's just finish off the Sefer Achinu. He says, now some of the laws of this mitzvah are included in this mitzvah. But again, explaining a little bit how it's possible to love someone as you love yourself. It doesn't mean you have to love them, but how you express your behavior towards them. That just as a person would behave towards themselves, so they would behave towards someone else. Lishmor mamono, just as a person protects their own money, and avoids any harm, so too others. Similarly, just as you want people to speak in a praiseworthy way and relate your honor, and not to say anything disparaging about you. Sorry, so very strong words. It says in Yerushalmi, one who gets honor by disgracing their fellow human being, they have no place in the world to come. You can't step on somebody else in order to raise yourself up. However, somebody who treats somebody else with love and with peace and with friendship and seeks their well-being and their benefit, and the only thing good for them. And the Apostle in Yeshaya, who says about them, Israel, about you I will be glorified. And we'll see that the prophet here is alluding to this idea that if we consider ourselves all to be Banim Lashem Elokeich, and that we are all God's children, we are all a part of this idea of Klal Yisrael, of Am Yisrael, we are all one people, we are all one nation, we are all God's children, that a parent, we've used this analogy before, a parent wants nothing more than to see his children getting on well with each other. That gives nothing greater than the parent. The parent whose children, argue publicly and fights in front of others, that's embarrassing for them. But a parent gets no more nachas than when others report to them, I saw your children, how beautifully they behave, how well they get on with each other. There's no greater nachas. And same with Kodesh Baruch Hu. Not that he needs it, but that's how what we reflect. When Jewish people are able to behave respectfully towards each other, there's nothing greater for our Kodesh Baruch Hu. Okay, that's the Sefer Chinuch. We move on slightly to the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, a similar work that sets out every single one of the mitzvahs in order. It says, Mitzvah Aras Melech Kamocha, Kalo Shel Davar, Darach Sani Lechavrecha Lo Ta'avid, to the Iter of Masechah Shabbos, and we saw that idea of Hillel, that which is hateful, you don't need to do it to anyone else. Risham Midim Nadarim, and he quotes the Risham Nadarim. This is very interesting. Mishi Yoshev Mechatech Basa Vikayado B'Sakin Vitakzo Yado Taka Yado Linake. The Risham asks again a famous question, but an important thing to say, rhetorical question. If a person is sitting and they're cutting something, they're cutting meat, and the knife in their right hand accidentally slips and cuts their left hand, would that person take the knife in their left hand and then go and cut their right hand in order to avenge what their right hand did to them? Nonsensical. Why? Because the left hand and the right hand are parts of the same body. That is the attitude that we're trying to inculcate here from this mitzvah. But it doesn't make sense, and as I see, we'll see from the context what we're talking about here about taking revenge and bearing a grudge. But Kamocha is saying anything you were to do negative to a fellow Jew, in fact, you're harming yourself, because we are all one body, we're all one people. That's why it says that's why it says your friend, this person, has a close connection to you. What is mitzvahs? We're talking about a fellow Jew who is your friend, meaning they are someone who keeps Torah mitzvahs. And this is quite a controversial thing he's saying here. He goes on and says, quotes more in Pesachim that says, Aval Adam, Rasha, Ben Mekabel, Tochacha, Mitzvah, Lisonosoi. However, that only reflects this requirement to love your fellow Jew and not to harm them refers to another Jew who is observant of Torah mitzvahs. But if a person is a Rasha, they're wicked. They've gone away from the ways of Torah, and you try and rebuke them in a loving way in order to bring them back to the correct path, and they don't listen to you, then mitzvah so then there's a mitzvah to hate them. Shneimah, the Pasuk says, Yiras Hashem sinas ra. Those who fear God hate evil. So we haven't really got time to get into that aspect. It's not really what we're talking about here, but we see almost there is possibly a limit to the scope of this mitzvah of Ahavta L'Recha Kamocha, which is you love those who share the same values as you and behave in the same way as you would behave. Now that doesn't mean that anybody who's not identical to you and doesn't necessarily share the same values, you shouldn't have any respect for or love them. But he's talking out here about something very specific, where you are trying to encourage somebody for the right reasons to do the right things, and they're just not listening to you. Then you don't have a mitzvah to love them, and some would say you may have a mitzvah to hate them, because that's about protecting yourselves and others from learning from them. Okay, but I just thought that the first part really is the most important part, really, this idea of you wouldn't take revenge on one hand for having damaged the other hand. And therefore, it just must make sense and why we would take revenge on a fellow Jew. And that really links into the context of this mitzvah. You'll see verse 18 is, the last part of it is, This is the mitzvah. You should love your fellow Jew as yourself. I am God. If you look at the context, it comes in the whole line of other mitzvahs, and it's linked to the previous mitzvah is you mustn't hate your fellow Jew in your heart. Almost seems to contradict what we just said here. However, you shall surely rebuke your fellow Jew. You cannot, so you should not incur guilt, meaning you literally shouldn't carry his wrongdoing. Meaning again, we say that we have this idea, we are all responsible for each other. All Jews are part of one family, and therefore we have responsibility to make sure that everybody in that family is doing the right thing. Now, if they're not, then we have a requirement to try and reprove or rebuke them. In order that, so it's not do not hate them, rebuke them, it's in order that we don't come to hate them. Back to what we said up here. That's not what we want. We want to be able to encourage them to follow the correct path. But we can't just stand idly by. Again, if you're a person was to see someone in their family that they're close to, they love, doing something which they know is damaging to them, who would stand by and not say anything? Obviously, there are ways and means of doing it. You have to pick the right time and the right words, but you don't stand idly by. And then the Torah goes on and says, do not take revenge, do not bear a grudge, to the children of your people. I am Hashem your God. So very interesting in terms of the context. Here the idea of revenge and grudge. Gemara talks about what's the difference between taking revenge and bearing a grudge. Well, the simple idea is this: revenge is somebody asks you ask somebody for a favor and they refuse you. If they at some later point then ask they ask you a favor, if you were to refuse them, that's taking revenge. That's losikom. Lositor is bearing a grudge. Again, similar scenario. You ask a favor from them, they refuse you. Some point later, they ask a favor of you. You do the favor for them. You say to them, "I'm going to help you, even though you didn't help me." That's bearing a grudge. That's saying, "I'm not going to be like you. I'm going to do the right thing, but you know what? I've not forgotten the fact that you didn't help me when I asked you to help me." Both of those are forbidden. Both of those are mitzvahs lot, say you mustn't do them. You have to love your fellows yourself, Ani Hashem. Meaning, and this idea of Ani Hashem is very interesting. You often will see, you see in Parshat Kedoshim, you see this a lot. Ani Hashem, meaning I'm God. I know what's in your heart. I know what's in the other person's heart, and I know what's motivating you. And what it's saying is also Ani Hashem, that I, God, created every single human being. Every single being is the Tselem Elokim, is in the image of God. That's what we need to keep focus on. Even if someone has wronged you and you think I've got a right to take revenge on them, or I'm not going to take revenge, but I'm going to bear a grudge. No, you've got to see beyond that. You've got to see that this person is created the Tselem Elokim. They didn't lose that just because they, at one point in time, they did something which upset you. You've got to maintain that love for them because they remain somebody created in the image of God. Okay. So that's interesting to seeing in its context, understand it a little bit more about this idea of loving your fellows yourself, meaning maintain your responsibility, the correct attitude towards your fellow Jew, regardless of how they're behaving either towards you or in general. If you look at the Ramban on this, the Ramban says something interesting. He says this is an expression by way of an overstatement. And this really gets to the heart of how can we be expected to love somebody else, particularly people who don't behave very nicely towards us or other people. He says it's an overstatement, for a human heart is not able to accept a command to love one's neighbor as oneself. Moreover, Rabbi Akiva has already come and taught your life takes precedence over the life of your fellow human being. So if you're in a situation, chas v'shalom, where you can only either save yourself or somebody else, your life takes precedence. Because it says that because the Torah says your brother shall live with you. What meaning you got to live in order he can live with you. The situation where only you can save yourself or somebody else, you save yourself. So therefore, how can you say you have to love somebody as much as you love yourself? Well, if you love them as much as you love yourself, then you should save them rather than save you. So he answers, rather the commandment of the Torah means that one is to love one's fellow being in all matters, as one loves all good for oneself. Again, similarly to what we said in the Sefer Chinuch, that it's not about, and this runs always through Torah and mitzvahs, which is a very nice idea. You should love your fellow as your fellow human Jew as yourself. That's not what's firstly required. That's not what's expected, and it's not realistic. What we're saying is how you express it. How do you love someone as yourself? By doing those things for other people that you would do for yourself, or you want them to do for you. That's what we're talking about. Okay, let's move on slightly. Says the Kavayasha, it's a bit more of moving slightly different direction now. So it's written, and you should love your fellow as yourself. The sages have remarked that this verse is fundamental principle of the Torah, as we saw this. There's no greater display of love than the mandatory rebuking of one's Jewish brother. He sees him some unseemly matter, that is sin or transgression. But the souls of all Israel are intimately connected to one another. It's the idea we just mentioned before. But the guidance for this rebuke is that if one understands the tribulations, effects, and punishments that the soul of a person is subjected to after it leaves the body, he must inform him. For perhaps through this, his companion will also have the merit to abandon his evil path, and then he will see the fulfillment of the verse. He will return and heal him. That was the verse we saw earlier somewhere. Anyway, so what is he saying here? That B'ahatarech Kamocha means generating within ourselves a genuine love for our fellow Jews, to the extent where we are motivated in order to make known to them the damage that they possibly are doing for themselves in the future. Meaning, not necessarily in this world. In fact, other sources will say, I haven't got time to look at it now, but other sources will say, B'ahatarech Kamocha means doing things that enable not a person just to live in this world. And that goes to what the Rambam was saying, is that our life takes precedence. It doesn't go to that extent we have to give up our life for somebody else. But the extent it goes to is we have responsibility to make sure that other person makes it to the world to come. And therefore, if we see in them doing things which could put that in jeopardy, we have a responsibility. B'ahatarech kamocha means we have a responsibility not to stand idly by, but in some way to try and make known to them the potential damage that they are doing to themselves. That's what I think he's saying here. I think that's also a fascinating insight into this idea of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. We move on slightly, in a couple of minutes left, 5 minutes left. We move on to Shmir Saloshan, the sefer written by the Chofetz Chaim. You can see clearly that where this idea of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha would mean avoiding doing or saying anything that could damage somebody else. He says when we reflect upon this in truth, we find the fulfillment of the mitzvah of judging one's friend in the scales of merit, and the trait of guarding one's tongue depend on the fulfillment of the positive mitzvah of you shall love your friend as yourself. If one truly loves his friend, he certainly will not speak lashon hara against him, and he will seek merit for him with all of his strength. For if it happened to him that he did something unfitting, and people were standing and talking about that thing, and he knew of some aspect of merit in himself, whether it were his having acted unwittingly or the like, how much he would desire that there was someone who would speak up for him, so he would not be unduly shamed. Exactly this should be do for his friend. So fascinating. Here he's saying that obviously, the Chofetz Chaim dedicated his life to teaching about avoiding lashon hara, but here he's actually saying it goes even beyond this. That B'ahatarech kamocha is knowing that you could be an advocate on behalf of somebody else, knowing how damaging it is for someone's reputation that they've done something which appears to be wrong, but may actually not necessarily be that. We said, dan l'chafschus. We always, another mitzvah is always to judge people, give people the benefit of the doubt, but people don't often do that. People see something on the face and they say, let's take the example of these football clubs, and this may well be the motivation, but it may not have been. People say, shout greed. Yeah, these people are greedy. That may be the case, but it also may not be. There may be very pure intentions. I'm not sure they were, but there may be. And in every scenario, you can always find some merit. The what the Chofetz Chaim is trying to say to us is to be cognizant of the fact that if people were to talk about you negatively, how much you would want someone to be an advocate on your behalf and stand up for you and say, you know what, you're wrong, you've got it wrong, you've misjudged this person. Yes, on the face of it may appear what they've done is wrong, but there's good reason for it. They may have done it unknowingly, unwittingly. That's what we have to do for other people. If we have the opportunity to stand up for somebody else and right what appears to be a wrong, character assassination, etc., then we have the responsibility to do that. That comes under the scale of V'ahavta kamocha. Fascinating way, another way of looking at it. And he goes on. And so it is exactly with the blessed Creator vis-a-vis the children of Israel, his holy people. For they are like sons to him, as it's written, you are the sons of the Lord your God. He rejoices in their good, and grieves in their cries and in their shame. And this one, the friend goes in the eyes of the Father, whose glory fills all the world, and shames his son before people to no purpose. What pleasure has he from this? The Rambam has adduced a principle in respect to the mitzvah of, and you shall love your friend as yourself, that one should be just as solicitous of his friend's possessions and honor as he is of his own. And as stated by the Talmud of Eliyahu, thus did the Holy One, blessed be, said to Israel, my beloved son, do I lack anything that I ask it from you? What do I ask of you? Only that you love one another and honor one another and fear one another, and that there be not among you transgressions and theft and unsightliness, so that you not be rejected forever. Wherefore it is written, he has told you, O man, what is good and what is good, the Lord your God asks of you, but you judge rightly and love loving kindness and walk humbly with the Lord your God. So again here, he puts it beautifully, how we mentioned earlier, this idea that if we are God's children, a parent doesn't need anything necessarily from their children, but what they would like is to see them get on with each other, is to treat each other with respect and dignity, to look out for each other, to stand up for each other, and at the very least, not to go around speaking Lashon Hara about each other or mistreating other people, and all the other things we saw in Sefer Chinuch, and that would come under this gather of just as you care about your own possessions, you care about their possessions, because we're all God's children. And with that, actually, that's really what V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is trying to remind us of. And then I think one final source, the Shalah says, very interestingly, slightly tangentially, he says the difference between the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple. Again, this is famous, well known. We know that the first temple was destroyed because the people of that generation were involved in the three cardinal sins of murder, adultery, and idolatry. Why was the second temple destroyed? Merely because the Jewish people couldn't, because of sin and schinam. The Jewish people couldn't get on with each other. Look what he says. He says, in the times of the second Beis Hamikdash, there was no, the Avodah Zarah had disappeared. People no longer had a desire to worship idols. They'd been defeated. What Numa brings down. So what was the sins of their time? A new sins came up. A new type of idolatry came. What was that? Kina, envy, sinner, and hatred. We know the second temple was destroyed because of unnecessary hatred. Now, what's interesting is, although the first temple was destroyed because of the most heinous crimes of the three I mentioned, it was rebuilt. Whereas the second temple, which was destroyed for what appears to be a lesser sin, and you could argue sins between Adam and the Chavero, between us and our fellow human beings, whereas the destruction of the first temple was based because we sinned between us and God, and yet that temple was rebuilt. This temple has not yet been rebuilt because we've not purified ourselves from that sin. Okay. Therefore, the Mashiach hasn't yet come. Yeah. The first temple was destroyed because of the sin of idolatry, which goes completely against the mitzvah of loving God with all your heart and with all your soul, and yet it was rebuilt. Whereas the destruction of the second temple was because of the sin between Jews, one person and another. The sin of unnecessary hatred is the complete opposite of the mitzvah of you should love your fellow as yourself. So we think, so right at the end here we're saying, if we thought, right back at the beginning, yeah, it's a nice idea, it's very nice, it's a great principle in the Torah, don't do what is hateful to other, what hateful to you, don't do to other people. That means treating other people with respect and acting towards their possessions and all the things in the way we want people to possess us. It's a nice idea. It's a nice principle, really nice ideal. You know what? Not that important. Yeah, what's more important is Shabbos and Kashrus, how I relate to God. It's quite clear that's not the case. The Shema is telling us that's complete fallacy, because there was a time when we went against God Himself. Yes, He destroyed the temple, but that temple was rebuilt. But when we can't get on with each other, the temple was destroyed, and it's that temple that still hasn't yet been rebuilt. So that's why I think it was what Rabbi Akiva means, and there's no shock to the fact that Rabbi Akiva lived the times of the destruction of the second temple. This is the great principle in the Torah. If you want to know what God wants most of us, it's just that we get on with each other. Here, end of the lesson. Any observations, comments, disagreements? Happy to take.
Can I ask? How does Don Lekavtachas giving the benefit of the doubt to someone work with Maras Ayin? You shouldn't put yourself in that situation in the first place. It almost seems like one of them's unnecessary.
Yeah, 100%. So interestingly, we talk about this idea of Maras Ayin. We think it's quite wide-ranging. Actually, the Talmudic definition is quite limited. There are very few scenarios in which a person would not be able to do something because of Maras Ayin. So yes, you're right. It goes both ways, isn't it? That you shouldn't put yourself in a position of suspicion.
Yep.
At the same time, it doesn't negate the person's responsibility when they see someone doing something which could possibly have negative connotations, for them to say there must be a good explanation for it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're right. We mustn't put ourselves in that situation, but that doesn't say, well, that it gives people carte blanche to say, oh, there's a good reason they shouldn't have been doing that thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay, any other comments? Otherwise, we'll leave it there.
Today's comments relate very nicely to the football scandal, when 4 of the English football clubs are owned by Jews.
Right. Yeah, we have to be very careful how we behave, because people say, oh, yeah, people are very quick to point and say Jews, money, greed, etc. Yeah, that old trope has, unfortunately, doesn't disappear. We have to be very careful. Very careful. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Keep well.